Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we finally got our very first spoilers for the Final Fantasy Magic the Gathering collaboration. There is a full standard set coming out in June, as well as 4 commander decks. And those of you who have been with the channel for a while probably know that I'm also an avid console gamer. I love single-player, story-driven games, specifically on PS5, but I pretty much have every console, and I've always loved Final Fantasy. So even though I'm not 100% won over on the idea of having all of these new universes beyond set and having all of them standard legal going forward, I am absolutely thrilled at the prospect of having a full Final Fantasy set and it being standard legal so that I can just go wild with all of my crazy standard deck techs using these cards. That being said, this video in particular, we're going to cover the commander decks, the 4 commander decks that were unveiled, but I do have another video on the way that's going to cover all of the brand new cards spoiled, the very first cards spoiled for the base set that will be standard legal, so definitely check that one out. I'm going to put the link in the comments and in the description so you guys can check that out if you'd like, but first of all, let's dive into these commander decks. So first off, we have the Limit Break commander deck. This is the colors of Naya, so white, green, and red, and this one features Cloud X Soldier as the commander. It's important to note that all of these commander decks are themed around the specific game that the commander was in. So this entire commander deck will be themed around Final Fantasy VII, which I actually think is super cool, and there will be a ton of new cards in the deck, as well as old cards that are reprinted, but reskinned and renamed as things from the Final Fantasy universe, which I think will be really rad. The next one is Revival Trance. This is the Final Fantasy VI commander deck, and it features Terra, Herald of Hope as the commander. It's in the colors of Mardu, so black, white, and red. And I'm really excited about this one. Final Fantasy VI is very OG. Super interested to see how they make this relevant with modern aesthetics, with new art for the cards. Should be super cool. Next up, we've got Tidus, Yuna's Guardian. This is the commander deck for Final Fantasy X, obviously. It's called Counter Blitz, featuring Tidus as the commander. And it's in the colors of Bant, so blue, white, and green. And then the last one is a deep cut, super interesting. I'm really excited to see this one. This is Scions and Spellcraft, an Esper colored commander deck, white, blue, and black. Featuring Y'shtola as the commander. The card is Y'shtola Knight's Blessed, and I have been a huge fan of Final Fantasy XIV. I stayed away from it for so long because I didn't want to lose my entire life to the game, and I knew that it was an MMO. But during quarantine, over COVID quarantine, I had extra time, and I decided to pull the trigger and start playing that game. And throughout 2020, I actually ended up spending like 2,000 hours in that game. It is insane. I didn't know that the best single-player Final Fantasy stories were locked inside an MMO, but they are, and that game's crazy. But let's talk about the cards. So we have 4 different commander cards here, and each of them comes in their own commander deck, and every single card in the commander deck is themed around whatever game the character comes from, which is super interesting. We're going to start here with Y'shtola Knight's Blessed. She is a 2/4 legendary creature cat warlock with vigilance for 4 mana in the colors of Esper. And before we move on really quick, I want to point out that she comes from Final Fantasy XIV, and I love that they gave her the Esper color pairings, because it's perfect for her character. She starts out as a mono white mage at the beginning of the story, but by the point in the story that we're at right now, she's kind of a mono black mage, and she's known for all of her spell slinging, which is represented by the blue. So I think Esper is just kind of perfect thematically for Y'shtola. But she also has a couple of crazy abilities. At the beginning of each end step, if a player lost 4 or more life this turn, you draw a card. This ability is bananas in multiplayer in Commander, because if you have a ton of players sitting at the same table, every single turn from every player, if anybody at all loses 4 life, whether it's them, one of your other opponents, or you'll get to draw a card at the end of that turn. So you're almost guaranteed to just draw an extra card during every single player's turn, which is bananas. But then you have the second ability. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or greater, Y'shtola deals 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life. Also kind of nuts, every single non-creature spell with mana value 3 or greater just drains 2 from everybody. And if that wasn't enough, if you manage to cast 2 3-drops in the same turn, you'll drain 4, and you'll trigger the first ability, drawing you a card at the end steps. So I feel like Y'shtola is just really, really crazy. And honestly, for the first time in a long time, I'm really feeling like I want to buy a commander deck just so I can build around Y'shtola, because I think she's kind of nuts. But we're going to move on. Next up is Cloud X Soldier. Obviously, Cloud's from Final Fantasy VII, so his deck will entirely be themed around Final Fantasy VII. He is a 4/4 legendary human soldier mercenary with haste for 5 mana in the colors of Naya. That's white, green, and red. And when Cloud enters, you attach up to 1 target equipment you control to it, which is already kind of powerful. Colossus Hammer, anybody? I'm sure we'll see a bunch of crazy equipment in this set as well, like his Buster Sword and all sorts of crazy shenanigans. So when you take into account all of the equipment that already exists and the potential new equipment that's going to come up, this ability could be nuts, given that you have haste as well. You're immediately swinging in with whatever equipment you want, which, if unchecked, could be scary. I also want to point out really quick that the colors are really nice here because red and white sort of go with the equipment vibe in Magic, but having green be a part of Cloud's color identity sort of symbolizes the life stream and the planet's involvement, so I really, really like that about Cloud. His last ability, whenever Cloud attacks, you draw a card for each equipped attacking creature you control, and then if Cloud has power 7 or greater, you create 2 treasure tokens. So the wider you go with equipped creatures, the more cards you get to draw. And if Cloud is just big enough, which let's be honest, if you're equipping anything to him at all and abusing that ability, that first ability, he's going to be at power 7, or else you built your deck wrong. You get to also get 2 treasure tokens, and so use that to vomit out even more stuff. Another creature to equip your stuff to, another equipment to equip to your creatures, whatever the case may be. Just seems like a ton of value packed into Cloud. I don't know how good it will end up being. I feel like Wizards has been trying to push, equipment tribal for a while now, trying to put out support for equipment decks in pretty much every set we've gotten for years now, and it just hasn't quite hit that mark yet. It hasn't quite been super, super viable, but in Commander, it very well may be. The next one is Terra, Herald of Hope. She comes from Final Fantasy VI, an OG classic. Absolutely love that game. Played that back in the day when it first came out. So revolutionary. I love Final Fantasy, guys. I don't know what to tell you. She's a 3/3 legendary human wizard warrior for 3 mana in the colors of Mardu. Her entire deck is themed around Final Fantasy VI. And she has her trance ability, which she actually has in that game, which is really, really cool flavor. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you mill 2 cards. Terra gains flying until end of turn. And then also, whenever Terra deals combat damage to a player, you can pay 2, and when you do, return target creature card with power 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is actually way more powerful than it looks. Sure, you have to pay mana, so it's not as good as something like the new Alesha that we got recently that does something similar, because Alesha can scale and get more and more and more expensive things, and you don't have to pay the mana. But it's really easy to overlook that Terra brings back things that are power 3 or less, not converted mana cost 3 or less. So you can bring back some really powerful stuff that's really expensive that just happens to have, a low power, like say a meteor golem or something like that, where it gets to destroy whatever you want when it enters the battlefield. So there's some pretty crazy stuff I think you can set up with Terra. It's also worth noting she's always going to have flying on your turn. She's always going to be swinging in with evasion, so you have way less of a risk of her dying in combat. You get to trigger the ability more consistently every turn because of that evasion, because of that flying. And yeah, getting to mill 2 cards every turn is really good too, because you're a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're filling up your graveyard with the stuff you want to pull out, so you don't have to rely 100% on other cards in your deck filling up your graveyard for you. She just kind of has it built in, which all of that is really, really nice. So I think Terra could be really, really awesome, and I'm excited to see what other crazy Final Fantasy VI themed cards are in this deck. But we're going to get to the last card today, and that's Tidus. Yuna's Guardian, a 3/3 legendary creature human warrior for 3 mana in the colors of Bant. That's blue, white, and green. And I kind of like the flavor behind his color pairing here as well. It really makes sense for the character. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may move a counter from target creature you control onto a second target creature you control. This is really interesting. Not only is it powerful mechanically, because you can move, obviously, your +1/+1 counters, but more important than that, you can move things like your flying counters, your death touch counters, all sorts of crazy indestructible counters that you create on your god creatures, maybe, things like that. You can move all sorts of really valuable counters around with Tidus, and then you can even kind of take it another step and maybe move like finality counters around to like your opponent's creatures, right? You don't have to target, oh, it is creatures you control. That's a bummer. It would have been super fun if you could move finality counters onto your opponent's creatures. But still, there's a ton of value here and a ton of versatility. And most importantly, thematically, I like how this sort of references both the Sphere Grid in Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is the game that he comes from, and the entire deck will be themed around Final Fantasy X. That game uses the Sphere Grid as its leveling up system. And that ability sort of represents the Sphere Grid in a way, which is really interesting, and at the same time, it also sort of represents Blitzball, which is the main mini-game in Final Fantasy X, which is kind of a sport where you're throwing a ball and trying to get to a goal. And so passing around counters both make sense sort of in how the Sphere Grid is laid out and how Blitzball works within the game, and I think it's just a huge flavor win. But then you also have the ability Cheer, which is actually one of his abilities in the game, and whenever one or more creatures you control with counters on them deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card and proliferate, but do this only once each turn. So if you're playing your deck correctly, you get to draw an extra card on every one of your turns, but you also get to proliferate once a turn for free without spending any mana, which can be super, super powerful. We've all seen the proliferate decks. We know how powerful it can be at the top end, and having potentially a new proliferate commander deck with Tidus as the commander just seems super, super fun. But that's going to do it for today. I do have another video coming that has a slew of new cards for Final Fantasy Magic: The Gathering, the very first cards unveiled for the standard legal base set. That video is coming right on the heels of this one, so look forward to that one soon. Like and subscribe, it helps the channel grow. Smash the button so more people see the video. Do all the things, and I'll be back. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.